I am Starsky Wilson. I am absolutely pleased to represent Deaconess Foundation in this space and place. I got to start by doing a couple of things, though, if this is okay. So just give me a second to get my bearings. First, I'm really commended to you by David Martineau. And so I want to thank David for thinking it, to use biblical language, he thought it not robbery to advance my name. And so thank you, David, for the opportunity. I do that up front such that you know that anything I say that you don't like, you can blame David because he's the reason that I'm here. I also want to again thank the leaders of MOHAG for the opportunity to share again. I've had the occasion in one of the regional gatherings in St. Louis to be with you and reflect on our experience at Deaconess Foundation. And of course now with a bit of time between that, we'll seek today to integrate some of our thoughts and reflections based upon the work that really I was doing on behalf of the foundation and members of our community through the work of the Ferguson Commission. I'm seeking to do something. I also have to tell you this. It is difficult for me often, if not always, to be able to articulate in moments ahead, particularly weeks ahead, the aims of a particular message in time. I am a pastor at my heart, and I believe in the movement of the Spirit, or that there is a guiding spirit and or being that takes us places in moments that we would not have gone otherwise, and that I believe that works communally. I come to know what I am to know as I come to be who I am called to be, and that is all by the inputs of community. And something happened this week in community when I had already articulated what would be shared for today, and it had much to do with our experience in the foundation. And we will seek to integrate that, to talk about our theory of change and how we have sought to work that out. But there's something else that I think is even more palpable, even more powerful, even more important as we seek to offer a bit of a pep talk, if you will, to the practitioners who are in this room. And that is the example and the witness of a powerful emerging practitioner who I'd like to center in this conversation today. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to attempt to hit the stated learning objectives, but I also want to try to do them from a place where you see an emerging model in an individual who inspires me so much. Is that all right? Now, thank you very much. Somebody understands me. I thank you I had to give some people permission, but you gave them permission. I serve a diverse church at St. John's Church, the beloved community. I was ordained and grew up in the historic black church tradition in the Progressive National Baptist Convention, which is the home of Dr. Martin Luther King and others. But the church I serve is in the United Church of Christ. The United Church of Christ is a predominantly white, though diverse denomination. And so I find myself teaching, preaching, and sharing in diverse contexts. And what I found out was when I went into predominantly white context as we consider diversity, inclusion, and equity, that white people found it rude to talk while the speaker is talking. Black people are not at all constrained by such protocol. And so I have to tell you that I don't find it rude for you to talk back to me. In the historic black church tradition, it's call and response. It actually helps me keep my time. So if there's something that you seek to affirm, go ahead, do so. That's okay. I'll be all right. I'll find my place if I lose it. Is that all right? What I'd like to do today is really reflect on the experiences that we've had as we consider our own approach as a health conversion foundation to the events that presented to all of us as a community in St. Louis and really as a state and emerging as a nation on August 9th, 2014. Unfortunately, that date has been emblazoned upon many of our memories because we know that on August 9th, 2014, in an unfortunate interaction between Darren Wilson, a police officer for the Ferguson Police Department, and Michael Brown, Brown Jr., a recent graduate, one of the last people to attain the necessary credits for graduation from the Normandy School District before it was taken away and recrafted as the Normandy Schools Collaborative. Because of that interaction, our entire community, our entire state took pause, had to, at least for 4.5 hours during the time that Michael Brown was lying on the ground, took pause to take stock of who we are as a people, who we have become as a state and as a region, and who we might become as a nation if we do not respond to certain realities. On that date, we began to see that there were things that we have not been paying attention to, not things that were created that day, nothing that was all of a sudden manifest like magic, but rather things that had evolved over time. Policies, systems, some that had suffered from benign neglect, some that by the intention of those who came before us, unfortunately did not treat all citizens fairly. And on the narrative picture of the framework of that interaction, we began to see many of these things clearly. What we saw clearly, quite frankly, was the disproportionate contact of police and people of young, black, and poor backgrounds in our communities. What we saw clearly, if we looked closely, if we paid attention to the narrative, we saw the disparate impact and outcomes of public school systems because Michael Brown graduated from the only non-accredited school district in our state. And he died on the line between an unaccredited school district and an accredited school district, a line that was uniquely drawn through a community and around housing complexes that were disproportionately populated by people whose skin had been twice kissed by God's Son. So we had to think about how we draw the lines in our community. He lived in a community that was started 100 years ago and imposed its housing policies were set up based upon restrictive covenants and housing codes that were put up to keep people from one another. And we took the time to look long enough. We saw a picture that didn't make sense to us because it didn't match our values. And so after some time, and let's be clear, it took some doing. August 9th was that unfortunate encounter, and on August 10th, a youth uprising began, an uprising that people like Dr. Alan Boesak, one of the scholars, leaders, political and religious of the South African anti-apartheid movement, one of those people who led that uprising of truth and reconciliation in South Africa a generation ago, says that when he looked at what he saw on August 10th, 2014 in Ferguson, it reminded him of the uprisings in Soweto. And while we took the time to see some things that were hard to see on August 9th, and while we saw images that were tough and reminded him of Soweto and us of Selma on August 10th and the days following, let us be clear, there was a vacuum of leadership from our elected officials, from those whom we had elected to give us policy guidance. Yes, there were activists on the ground, and yes, there were practitioners who began to respond to the reality, and yes, there were pastors who were seeking to be present. But I remind people all the time, because it's hard for us to keep this centered in our memory, while there was an uprising on August 10th, there wasn't a commission announced until late October. There wasn't a commission in place until November 18th, and there was a No True Bill announced and another uprising, and democracy was on fire on November 24th, and we didn't begin our work until December 1st. We were late to the game. And in between that unfortunate event and the subsequent uprising and the final time when we decided to come together as a community to study the reality, to consider the underlying social dynamics that have been exposed by these events, by the time that happened, democracy and much of our community was on fire. This was the picture of our community, but that picture is only narrative. It doesn't mean there are folks who work with their right brain and folks who work with their left brain. So I got to work with the people who are not the more creative people. So give me some statistics and give me some facts. What we found out when we took the time to look, and what we found out when we took the time to listen, is that our state lagged behind all others in the disparity of young black boys being put out of school and out of school suspensions. What we found, and some of you already knew, was that we lagged the nation in investment in early childhood education. What we found that some of you already knew is that 1 in 5 children in our community live in poverty. What we found that some of you already knew was that 2 in 5 black children live in poverty in the United States of America and in the state of Missouri. What we found that you all already knew is that if you live in predominantly white, portions of West St. Louis County, you lived a full generation longer if you live in Wildwood than if you lived in predominantly black West Wellston. We found what you already knew, that health disparities exist all throughout our community, and you can track them by zip code, and you can clearly track them by the color of one's skin. What we had to decide was, what were we going to do about it? And so the commission was called together by the governor, this diverse set of citizens, to decide what ought we do about it, with a particular eye toward policy. What policy recommendations, what calls to action can be articulated to help us to declare and to become what he called a stronger, fairer, and more inclusive region. Now, we said we'd talk about philanthropic theories of change. I didn't forget that. I'm just telling you, because the question came up, why would you get involved in something like this? And the question that we had to answer, and I had to answer it for my executive committee, and I had to answer it for my board at Deaconess Foundation, this institution with a heritage of 127 years, this institution that had been grant-making in our community, focused on health of the community with a particular eye toward children for a generation. Why will we get involved in this conversation? Isn't this a little too controversial? What does race have to do with your issues and outcomes as it relates to health? What does it have to do with your faith-based heritage? What does it have to do with your focus on child well-being? And the answer, quite frankly, was everything. I'm sorry, we're in St. Louis, so we had to say everything. Everything. It had everything to do with it. What do you mean it had everything to do with it? What we understood was this, was that we could spend down every dollar in our corpus and not make a dent in the kind of social inequities that we found in our communities. We could ramp up our programs. We could hop them up on 5-hour energy. We could put more in. We could seek to concentrate it. We could try to raise more dollars. But the reality is, if we didn't change the rules, then we'd have the same outcomes. And so we began to respond to the learning that we have gotten from organizations like the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy and grant makers for effective organizations, who are suggesting that philanthropies who desire to have greater impact in their communities are seeking to leverage and to align not only their grant-making dollars, but also their reputational capital. If they have a voice, they ought to be using it. And because philanthropy for the last 2 generations in America, and particularly in the last generation when our elective processes have not produced a whole lot, I shouldn't say a lot about that, but I'll just say, we have seen philanthropy driving policy, either by investing in models, demonstrations, projects, or showing proof of concept before things are adopted by the government. And so philanthropy has a role to play to show what can work. It also has a role to play in convening voices, in leveraging and brokering funding for things that others do not fund or would not otherwise. I say to folks, philanthropy ought to be the first dollars in for stuff that has not yet been proven, because the true history of philanthropy in America is that it is social venture capital for social change. Can I tell you my perspective on something? I had a conversation yesterday with a local businessman. I really appreciated where he was going. He was talking about this kind of pay-for-outcome model of philanthropy that is growing up. I can appreciate that's where he is with his market orientation and with his perspective on business. I don't believe that's an appropriate, I don't believe that is a faithful response to our heritage of philanthropy in America. If it worked, Thank you very much. If we knew that it worked, then corporate interests would pay for it anyway. I believe that part of our responsibility is to find the things that work, to support the things before we know they work, to help the things to be tweaked out, and to host the conversation so the community can dream together. And so our investments, working together with the investment of our friends from the Missouri Foundation for Health and others from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, is to say, let's create a space where the community can dream together. And that's ultimately what the commission process was to be. That was to be part of our hope. Let us gather 3,000 citizens together. Let us marshal their 30,000 volunteer hours and have them dream together about what this region could be. And this is the simple version of their dream. If you want a more specific version, there are 196 pages worth of it. I've got them a copy here, but you can find it at forwardthroughferguson.org. But our philanthropic investment was to convene a conversation where the community, in a participatory way, might dream. And this was the community's dream. It is simply this: we want to envision a community where we place children at the center. Those 2 out of 5 black children, those 1 in 5 children in our community who live in poverty, we want to start with them at the center. We want to have racial equity as the aim. The report is a path toward racial equity, and that is how we monikered it. On the very first page, we tell people, I know it's hard to talk about race, it gets uncomfortable, but make no mistake, this is about race. Children at the center, racial equity as the aim, with every individual having access to justice and opportunity. That's the whole vision said in a sentence. We desire to live in a region, we desire to live in a state where children are at the center of our conversations, where racial equity is our aim, and where all have access to justice and opportunity. Those are the 4 major segments of this report that the community came together to articulate as its dream. And with that report come 189 policy recommendations. And one of the lenses we used to prioritize recommendations is health equity. Is it focused on advancing and making equitable outcomes in people's health throughout our community? Now, that wasn't an accident. Because one of the ways, we don't suggest that we don't have a perspective, right? We don't suggest that we are neutral convener. I don't. Some of the literature says, well, be a neutral convener. I'm not neutral. Deaconess is not neutral. We never have been. Our first value is justice. Our values are justice, hope, service, identity, faithfulness. They're deeply rooted in our faith heritage in a progressive denomination of the United Church of Christ. We are not without a perspective. And so when we convene people, we've got a perspective to bring to bear. And some of that is also informed by our history as a health foundation, the many years where we operated health systems and hospitals in the St. Louis metropolitan community. And yes, we were conveners, but the fact that health equity was used as one of those lenses is actually reflective of our theory of change as well. If we are the convener, and I also say this, I'm sorry, a few things changed. Can I give you inside baseball? Yeah. Inside baseball. If you go and look at the executive order that created the commission, there were no words like child well-being in it. The words trauma-informed community weren't in it. There were words like community stability, family stability, education, social services, housing, all the transportation, workforce development, all of the segmented, siloed, systemic ways we talk about how we're going to care for people who happen not to be siloed, who happen not to be segmented, who happen not to be dismembered. And so part of our responsibility was to show up with our whole selves, to consider the whole community as whole individuals, to say that I know we never created in America a system of child well-being. The best we ever did was created a system where children might be educated between kindergarten and the 12th grade. But we never created an integrated system that cared for what it takes to get them the things that they need so that they may be educated. And so part of our responsibility was to take the limited frameworks that we have embedded in our systems and to seek to be a little bit more forward-thinking. And so our health perspective was helpful in that. And this was our community's dream. Now, the real question is, how do you get to such a dream? And those of you who know, particularly Black Baptist preachers, you know there's got to be at least 3 ways, and so I'll give you 3. And I want to suggest the way that we get to that, ultimately, if we will be faithful to getting to that vision that those 3,000 members of our community have articulated, and I think did so on behalf of many of the citizens of the rest of our state, then I believe we've got to engage in practice that is informed by proximity, that is aimed at equity, and that is shifting policy. That is informed by proximity, that is aimed at equity, and that is shifting policy. Now, I have a twin. You all didn't know that. I've got a twin. And my twin is in the room. Bob Hughes is my twin. Hi, Bob. He didn't know I saw him back there. So Bob and I are twins because we started in our respective roles in the community at the same time, almost at the same day. Literally, we were going to all of the events where people were honoring our predecessors, and we stood in the back nicely and leaned on each other. And then, of course, there was a series of events where saying, hey, meet the new guys. And then there was me and Bob. So Bob and I are twins. Well, why would I bring up the fact that we're twins? As we consider this, I had a really difficult time. Maybe Bob didn't have this issue. I had a difficult time when I came to Deaconess Foundation making one particular decision. You noted in the introduction that I pastor St. John's Church and that I also am CEO of the foundation. Well, these are 2 full-time jobs. And it is the case that if you had done one before, then you would leave one to go to the other. But I'd made certain kind of faith-filled commitments. I made certain vocational commitments when I went to the church that I would be there for 5 years. At the time, I had only been there 3 years. And while I felt called to the work at the foundation, I did not feel called away from the work at the church. For those who don't know, my church is in North St. Louis City in 63107. I describe it to people who do health equity work, who do nonprofit, who do social service work. It's one of those zip codes that everybody with the program wants to be in, but they don't want to put their building there. They need the population to articulate on their grant application that they're meeting the need, but they don't want the reality of the security concerns of putting a building in the zip code. That's where my church is. And so the reality is this: when I had to come, when the search committee finally decided, maybe rightly or wrongly, that I was the candidate to present to the board, I had to sit at a long, shiny table. It was longer than this, a long, shiny table, and they put me at this end, and then the chair of the board was at that end. I think they were trying to intimidate me, but they put me at the end, and I can't prove this, but I believe they adjusted my chair so that my chair was lower than everybody else's chair. And so I'm sitting at the table like this. I'm looking over, talking to the board, and what I had to share with them was I did not believe that I was called away from the church, and I understood, and they needed to know before they voted, and I had already shared this with the search committee. They needed to know before they voted that I didn't believe people should be able to sit on the 12th floor of buildings in downtown St. Louis in one metropolitan square, that you have to go past marble floors and get on these gold elevators and sit around tables this long that are shiny and have to make decisions for people in my neighborhood. And I didn't believe that was appropriate. And so it wasn't just that I didn't feel called away, but rather I felt a greater calling that if I was going to be doing work around this table, then I needed to be consistently connected to a neighborhood like that the kids that are in that neighborhood and that are in that church and the families that are impacted by the decisions we make in our grant making need to understand that somebody here not only cares about them, but knows them, knows their faces, knows their stories, knows their narratives, and will bleed with them them and cry with them. When they weep, I weep. And so because we had to do that, and so we had to create it's not a heroic Starsky story. What it is to say that we've got to create platforms by which we must also consistently, institutionally hear their stories. And so here, 5 years later, we've got a community advisory board with a 10-year-old on it, because you can't talk about child well-being and not listen to some children, right? And so we've got a policy advisory board where people who are directly impacted by this work, and thanks be to God, know it better than me, are telling us, if you're going to speak out on policy, Starsky, these are the things you better be saying, because you don't know this like we know this. I'm just saying, we've got to be informed by proximity, which brings me to this narrative. It's not just in our institutional realities. It is also in the individuals who emerge in our practice. I got to tell you a great story. A sister by the name of Brittany. I met Brittany because when I came to the foundation, in my first act with our Deaconess Nursing Scholarship, I presented a scholarship to Brittany. Brittany was one of the emerging students at the University of Missouri St. Louis in their nursing program. Brittany was a bright light, but she was little. She's a little bright light. She was small, she's petite, didn't know it at the time, but she was a single mom with a little girl named Mackenzie at home, and she was taking care of Mackenzie. Although she had been a teenage mother, she was there in school doing the best that she could. She became the president of the Student National Nursing Association, which is the National Association of African American students studying nursing, and she began to engage in this work. And so she was studying about how she could help to heal people. She was a healer and felt drawn into this work based upon her own experience. And so Brittany was just absolutely wonderful. And I like Brittany, and I would see Brittany every year at this banquet we would have for these scholars, learning about their realities. But I was jarred by a picture of Brittany that I came to see in the summer of 2014. I saw a picture of Brittany's wrists. I saw Brittany's wrists with clamps on them, places and imprints where twist ties of policemen's plastic handcuffs once were. She was showing the world the bandages or the brandishing marks that she received from her community with some of her friends and classmates when they decided to walk through the Ferguson open market crying Black Lives Matter. She had engaged in an effort to invite people into the disequilibrium of racial inequality, people who were going about their business as usual while other people were being oppressed. Her and some of her classmates decided, because she was committed to these kind of outcomes of true healing, not just cures that are medical that she could engage in with her nursing profession, but rather healing for a whole community that had been traumatized by images of racial injustice. She decided to go into the market, and they were determined. Clearly, I don't know about y'all, but I had a chance this weekend. Was my wife's birthday. I went shopping with my wife, and sometimes she buys stuff, and sometimes she don't. But if I'm with her, I'm just along for the ride, you know? And so you find yourself in marketplaces and malls, and sometimes you're buying and sometimes you're not. Well, they were among the people who weren't buying. Clearly, there were other people who weren't buying, but the fact that they weren't buying and they were yelling something that offended not only the sensibilities of some of the people there, but also the sensibilities of some of the officers, they got locked up for being there not buying stuff, even though there were other people who were there who didn't buy stuff. I'm just saying, that's an inequity. So I saw her wrists. She had begun to engage directly in the protest movement in the Ferguson Uprising. She did not believe that she could be a healing figure and not be engaged in this work. She grew up in Ferguson. She still lived in Ferguson. She lived there with her mother. And I came to see Brittany proximal and close to this work. It was such a trying reality for her that she decided she needed to take a semester off from school. The next time I saw Brittany in this was later in October, where Brittany, by virtue of the humiliation that our systems desire to put on people, Brittany was behind glass. She was among 13 young people who were arrested there one night in the rain in October when there was a light protest presence before on South fluorescent before the Ferguson Police Department, and because there was a light protest presence, but it had leaders of the protest movement like Brittany and Alexis and Jamel, they decided this was a good time to take people and lock them up. Not only did they take them and lock them up, I'm sorry, I didn't tell you why they locked them up. They locked them up for a noise ordinance violation. You know, noise ordinance violation. Some of y'all live in the suburbs. Don't act like you don't know what a noise ordinance violation is. You might remember it from when you were in college and you went to a party and somebody next door called those people and they came and shut down the party. The noise ordinance violation was what the owner of the house got in the mail. It was a violation that probably cost them about $150. That's what you do with a noise ordinance violation. You call the police. You have somebody come. You issue a $150 citation. Oh, unless they're engaged in an uprising and unless they're leaders of the uprising, then what you do is you take 13 young leaders, you take them into the St. Anne Police Department. I know they arrested them in Ferguson, but they took them to the St. Anne Police Department because the Ferguson Police Department was shut down because they were building a bigger, better jail to house people. And St. Anne had a jail that was so large that they contracted with other municipalities in the communities so that they could house people that other folk could lock up but couldn't hold up. You understand? So you take them, you put them, you lock them up, you send them to St. Anne, and you don't give them a $150 citation in the mail. You give them a $2,700 bond. And you give them a 24-hour hold. Oh, what's a 24-hour hold? Oh, it's a reason to keep you in jail before we tell you why you are in jail. And so in a 24-hour hold, and some with bonds as high as $2,700, a collective bond for the 13 of them over $35,000 when this group of interfaith clergy came to meet them that morning. The next time I saw Brittany was behind glass in an orange jumpsuit. Oh, you don't stop at locking them up. Even when you know that just on a 24-hour hold, you decide to humiliate this young nursing leader who desires to heal her community and raise her 10-year-old daughter by putting her in an orange jumpsuit and flip-flops. This is the picture of our community, and what I'm suggesting to you is that if we will respond faithfully and develop a vision of a new community where children are at the center, where racial equity is the aim, and where people have access to justice and opportunity, we've got to work in our healing practices. We've got to work as institutions and as emerging individuals and practitioners from a place of proximity. There is something in her nursing career when she sits down at someone's bedside or when she articulates the realities of public health for someone 20 years from now that she will understand in a greater way because she is connected and tied. She has proximal understanding of the realities of the injustices that come to young people like Michael Brown. And so I want to suggest if we're going to live toward that community first, we've got to engage in our institutions and we've got to be informed in our practice as practitioners by proximity. But then we got to be aimed toward equity. It's not just about proximity. It's not just that I know where you come from, because the reality is people can use that to beat other people upside the head. You know, I've seen it, unfortunately. You don't know where I come from. You don't, we're all in this work because we want to do this work, right? We may not have that same proximity, but we can aim toward equity. Now here, I've got to say that part of what Brittany is doing is she's seeking to make things a little more fair. Now, we've got to, I know y'all had a workshop yesterday, and David probably helped people y'all talked about inclusive clinics yesterday, and all, y'all went through all of this language. Now, so I don't have to do all that. I just say, for the people, everybody was at the workshop yesterday. Y'all got that? Everybody wasn't at the workshop. That's okay. So two things since you weren't at the workshop. I just need y'all to help me out. We're going to church for a second, because some people are going to sleep. We're going to go to church for a second. So tell your neighbor, say, neighbor, equity is not diversity. See, they learned that yesterday. You didn't learn that yesterday. See, tell somebody else. Say, neighbor, equity is not access. Somebody's still missing it. Tell your neighbor. Say, neighbor, equity is not equality. Okay, tell somebody else. Say, neighbor, equity is not opportunity. Now, you know you just totally messed up somebody at your table, don't you? This is the thing. I think we got to get this because we confuse these terms all the time. And there is a progression. I won't go too deep because there are people better prepared than I that are in this room. But I do want to say this. We got to be clear that equity itself, I'm concerned about this distinction between equity and equality. Equity, in many cases, in most, equity is about supports. Equality is about standards. Equity is about outcomes. Equality is about opportunity or access. What's the difference? Part of what we found in these communities was not that people didn't have a chance to get an education. They didn't have a chance to get to better health, although you don't have much of a chance if there ain't no fresh fruit in your neighborhood. You don't have much of a chance if you don't have walkable sidewalks in your neighborhood. You don't have much of a chance if you live in certain buildings or building services. You don't have much of it, but they had a chance. The question is, have we gone so far as to provide the additional supports to them that they needed to actually have the same outcomes? It's not about a chance, a hope, and a prayer. And we're investing collective resources, as we do with tax bases and the like, then we should actually be aimed toward getting people the supports that we desire. I did say I had a perspective, didn't I? Now, everyone doesn't agree with that perspective, but this was the hope of those 3,000 people, so I articulate based upon that. Why do I do that? I do that based upon this issue in our theory of change, that we believe that you get to better outcomes in a community and you get to better policy for a community if, I don't know, you actually listen to the community. It's one of the reasons why we invest resources in bringing people to Child Advocacy Day in Jefferson City. And we believe there ought to be some, I don't know, children there. We believe if we're going to make policy that has impact for a generation, which is one of the other lenses we use in the Ferguson Commission work, is this going to impact the next generation, and does it have generational impact? Not just for us, but can it have generational impact? This is one of the ways we prioritize that work. If it would, then we advance that from the 189 to the 44. It's a part of what we believe in our theory is that you actually have to listen to people. You've got to be able to gather them, and they have better information than those who have been deemed experts by virtue of higher education. And so we believe that our work must be informed by proximity. We believe that our work should be aimed toward equity, but finally we believe that this work has to shift policy. Now, one of the clear, people miss this all the time, and I had to back away because I was getting agitated. It's easy for me to get agitated. Even in the morning before part of what was happening was, and I've got a lot of these conversations. We made a report, and we were called for in the executive order to make policy recommendations. And so we made 189 what we call calls to action. We didn't like the idea of recommendations because y'all know what y'all do with most recommendations you get. You file them, file 13. And so we made calls to action. And we centered on accountable bodies to articulate who was responsible for these things. The challenge is people responded to the report by setting up meetings with us to say, these are the things that we are doing that are aligned with your report. Now, this is the thing. I hadn't met anybody who couldn't find something they were doing that was aligned with the report. Well, I came to wonder, I mean, powerful people who believe that they didn't have power, people who were well-positioned, other people say wouldn't be well-positioned, people who were in small groups, people who were in large groups, people who had money, people who didn't have no money. Everybody had something that aligned, and all of these people aligned with the report, which made me wonder two things. First, why have I been wasting my time? Since everybody's already doing everything we're supposed to be doing. And second, if we're doing all this stuff really, honestly, with fidelity, how did we get here?
I know that's right.
And so part of what I found when I started digging deep into these reports is what people were doing was they were presenting a list of their programs. Oh, my program does this. And my program does this. And if we just had more funding for my program, then it would do this. Baby, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I had a big mama moment. I'm sorry. Everybody baby the big mama, I'm sorry, but we can't program our way out of racial inequity. we can't service our way out of health inequities. Philanthropy. Part of the challenge, I remind people all the time of this narrative. In June of 2014, the St. Louis metropolitan community was designated by Charity Navigator in their annual assessment of metro areas, metro markets, their metro market survey. Annually, they rank the philanthropic nature of different communities. And in June of 2014, the St. Louis metropolitan region was named #1 by Charity Navigator for its philanthropic investments. #1, first in the nation. It's funny how the calendar works. June of 2014. We're named #1 for our philanthropy. June, July, August of 2014, Michael Brown lie on the ground. For all of our investment, what is the issue? If it's about philanthropy, if it's about our generosity, if it is about the deep spirit of voluntarism that Alexis de Tocqueville talked about in Democracy in America, if we're doing it so well, then how do we get to this place? I think one of the ways we get here is connected to our theories of change. We overinvest in services and programs and underinvest in systems change and policy. Report called Leveraging Limited Dollars, 2013 report from the National Committee for Responsible Philanthropy argues that for every $1 we invest, in community-engaged strategies for policy change, public policy, nonprofit advocacy, either C3 or C4 word, community-engaged strategy, community organizing. For every $1 invested there is a return of $115 for public benefit. Why? Because the state is still going to be the #1 payer. And if we have the capacity to shift how those funds are distributed, then we have greater impact with our philanthropy. If you give enough money to a program to serve 100 kids, I believe they will serve 100 kids well. But I also believe you can give that same dollar to shift the policy for resources to give access for those kids, and you may be able to serve 100,000. I'm glad to support some of the greatest models for early childhood services in our nation that are right there in the St. Louis community. I believe they're doing magnificent work. They are sharing. We have innovated many of the things that the rest of the nation is doing well. The challenge is we have not invested in that which we have innovated. And so why is it? Why is it that the national policy shop that has guided the nation on individual development accounts and child development accounts and led states like Maine and Oklahoma to invest at scale in child development accounts is based in St. Louis at Washington University at the Center for Social Development, and they have what we have innovated in St. Louis in Maine, but my kids don't have access to it in St. Louis? Well, there's a problem with that. That's not because we don't believe in the concept. And quite frankly, now my kids have access to this, to a small approach to this because they go to St. Louis public schools. But why doesn't every child born in the state of Missouri have that? Why doesn't Mackenzie, Brittany's daughter, have that? Rather, this is what we do with our policy. I'm almost done. I'm going to be done. I mean, I'm done like a foundation CEO. I'm not done like a black preacher. Black preacher gets to close 3 times. I'm just, one time. As we consider the shifts of policy, what we should be thinking about with this wonderful emerging practitioner, this shero of mine named Brittany Farrell, is how we might appropriately support her to get through school. Can I give you some backstory? I had to have an argument. I didn't have to have the argument, but I mean, maybe I didn't have to, but it turned into an argument with the professor at her College of Nursing about why she was so moved that she had to take a semester off, and why a semester before graduation, if she felt that compelled, they needed to hold her seat for her. I had to engage with the administrators about why it was so important that her witness be preserved and that she be supported, because they had to make a policy assessment about whether she would be able to sit for boards this past week. I had to have a conversation with the leaders of those who managed her scholarships to say, I know she's not in class for nursing this semester, and maybe it doesn't make sense for her to be a nursing scholar, but I think she's doing work right now that impacts how we will order our lives as a community. You should know that I believe that we articulate values and then we share them and codify them in policy, that our ordinances, that our statutes, that our legislative acts are actually a codification of our values. And since we have a policy that suggests that we can't give her a scholarship in this way, we need to consider policy that informs how we should be able to support her. And if we've got to change the policy, let's change the policy. If we got to change the practice, let's change the practice. So what did we do? We engaged with the people who were giving her other scholarships and said, no, she's not doing nursing work this semester, but what she is doing is trying to help our community better articulate its values. She's trying to shift the environment that will cause us to do different kinds of policy. So what we're going to do this semester is call her a policy intern. Because as an emerging practitioner who is making a model for those of us in this room today, sometimes you've got to do what you've got to do, and you make the stuff fit what you've got to do. What am I trying to say? That the best of teachers are not constrained by the fact that there's not enough money in the budget in order to get the supplies for their kids. Today, they are a teacher, and tomorrow, they are a fundraiser at the church to make sure they've got the supplies they need for their kids. And that may be an example for us in social services. Today, we may need to be someone who is providing services through this mode of action, and tomorrow or on our off day or in the evenings, we may need to be somebody who's advocating in the streets. And if it takes both of them to get at the health and healing that we say we're working for when we're getting a check, then that is the model of practice that we need to follow. And so Brittany suggested that I can't heal people in a patient's room if I'm not healing a community in the streets, and I can't heal a community in the streets if I'm not engaging in the policy discussions in these kinds of deliberative rooms. So yes, I'll be a nursing student, and yes, I am a mother, and yes, I am a policy intern. And she lived that thing out too. She lived it out. She lived it out. So while I saw her in the summer with the clamps on her wrist, and while I saw her in the orange jumpsuit in October, what I saw in January was her convening and facilitating meetings of the Ferguson Commission with children in the community so they could articulate their vision for what the community ought to be. So she sat down with people from Vector Communications and Emerging Wisdom, and she learned facilitative techniques whereby she could facilitate discussions from young people so they could articulate their values, so that could be codified in the policy statements of the Ferguson Commission. I'm saying to you, if we're going to be who we believe we can be and who we believe we're called to be, if we're going to live healthy lives within the context of healthy communities, then our practice has to be working and oriented to shift policy. And that may mean that we've got to work more than 9 to 5. I'm sorry, I turned into a pastor for a second. I'm just saying, we've got to figure out to live. Ryan and I were in a session with grant makers in health not long ago. We got to figure out how to live whole lives committed to these missions. We've got to understand that we don't get to go home and leave the community. Anybody here get on a plane at the end of the day? If you don't get on a plane and go home at the end of the day, then recognize everything you do everywhere you go impacts all of your children as well. And so we've got to shift policy, because policy is where we speak the dreams of our community and we codify them in ordinances and legislation. And then the final thing we got to do is we got to be able to celebrate this work together. I believe that if we're going to get to healthy communities, if we're going to live healthy lives, then we have got to do work. We've got to engage in practice that is informed by proximity. We've got to do work that is aimed toward equity. But we must also, of course, do work that is shifting policy. And when we accomplish some of the stuff we will accomplish, we got to be able to turn up. I'm sorry, yeah. I'm sorry. I learned this term. Can I teach you a movement term? Movement term. Turn up. Turn up was a term. It's used in popular American parlance in the Western vernacular and colloquialism. To turn up means to be found, right? Something turns up. The keys you've been looking for, they turn up. But in urban slang, there's also to turn up is to get excited. That's not what I'm talking about. I wouldn't just come in here speaking slang to y'all, but rather there's a lesson that I learned, this term of turn up I learned with Brittany. And so something would happen in the actions in the uprising. People would articulate when and where the turn up is. The turn up was an event of disruption, resistance, and celebration all at the same time. And you saw some of them on television. You saw the disruption part. People talked about the disruption. They have blocked the door to the U.S. courthouse in downtown St. Louis. Yeah, we did. But it was a turn up. It was turn up because it wasn't just resistance and disruption. It was also celebration. Because the turn up never happens. The building of community, of beloved community, this multicultural, multiracial community was coming together, yes, to disrupt systems that oppress people, but they also came together to celebrate and honor one another. So the turn up didn't happen without Mama Cat, who always cooked food to make sure that people were nourished at actions in the daytime and at nighttime. So Mama Cat was an important part of the turn up. Mama Cat still providing in the turn up. She just earlier this week, she provided all the food for a reception after a funeral for a 15-year-old who was shot by police in St. Louis. There was a building of community that continues to be sustained. So the nurture that happened from Mama Cat's food met with the beat of the drum of KB Frazier. KB Frazier is a trans brother from the Central Reform congregation whose drum beat has become the heartbeat of the movement. And so you had Mama Cat's food cooking, and you got KB's drumming. And after you got KB's drumming, and you've got Mama Cat's food cooking, you start to hear the voices of Alexis and Mackenzie and Brittany calling out chants to people to help them keep the beat and to unify themselves by unifying their voices. And so the point of celebration comes when the food and the music and the voice all comes together. And when we come with the food and the music and the voice all together, we start crafting together a community that is an alternative witness to the brokenness and fragmentation and the disadvantage that we see each and every day. I'm trying to say we've got to celebrate and witness to this unified, reconciled, whole community while we're working toward this unified, reconciled, whole community. And we do that together in celebration. And somebody's saying here, that's fine, that's an okay little statement for you to make, but you got to give me something to celebrate. Can I offer you something to celebrate? If I can offer you something to celebrate, it is that this emerging leader of witness and in practice this week, after all of the turmoil, after going to jail several times, after being locked up for leading an action that stopped the highway movement, after having federal charges brought against her by the same prosecutor that brought charges that decided not to bring charges against Darren Wilson, while standing faithfully and with fierceness in the context of all of that. This little bitty sister graduated from the University of Missouri St. Louis's College of Nursing just earlier this year and just this week. And she posted yesterday that she sat for boards this week and she passed her board. So now she is Brittany Farrell, RN, BSN, and about to do some business in the community. And so she'll continue working through with policy, continue working through with practice, continue working through with proximity to get us to healthy lives in a healthy community. And if you can't celebrate what Deaconess has done and you can't celebrate what Ferguson Commission has done, you ought to at least celebrate what Brittany Farrell is going to do, because she's going to turn the whole world upside down. She's going to be the one that you invest in to get to a healthy community. She's going to be the one that will be at our bedsides to make sure we are engaged in healthy living. She'll be the one to make sure that community is inclusive, and she'll be the one guiding us toward equity. So I've come here today to celebrate my sister, my shero, my homegirl, that Deaconess Foundation nursing scholar, that Scholarship Foundation of St. Louis policy intern, who is an example, who is an image, who is a glimpse of the glory that we desire in healthy communities and healthy lives, by the name of Brittany Farrell. So I just invite you to celebrate my sister with me, because she gives the example of how we will get to the things we will talk about today and tomorrow. So thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for the opportunity to share. Thank you for the chance to shine a light on my sister, and thank you for the chance to celebrate her witness, because what she is doing is what you are doing. You are not alone, because Brittany has got your back. God bless you. Usually if I run away, they can't ask me questions, but I try.
I know
to
there are
get away with
probably a lot of questions and there are a lot of thoughts. We have some time for 2 or 3 questions, if possible. Are there any questions or thoughts or feelings that you might want to share after Reverend Wilson's presentation?
Thank you for your words, your inspiration. What is our next actionable step?
Yeah, thank you very much. There are many. I do encourage people to really begin by reading the report at forwardthroughferguson.org. There's also, just came out this week, one of the things we set up following the report in order to continue to monitor actions and to support actions that are going forward is an organization called Forward Through Ferguson, led by a dynamic young woman who was on our commission team named Nicole Hudson. This week, she actually put out a tracking report on actions, organizations that are moving different calls to action in different areas. And so the action will be different based upon who you are and where you're positioned, if you will. There's work, and I tell people to kind of start where you are. Out of 189 recommendations, first of all, you won't agree with all of them. But there will be, I tell people, you may not agree with all of them, but there'll be 3 or 4 that will change your life and change your kids' lives. Identify those. See where your passions align, and see how you might move, not alone, but with a group of people that may be the people you work with. It may be your congregation. To advance that particular recommendation or that small set. For people who are engaged in work in health, you may be very particularly interested in our community, and I was glad I had a conversation yesterday that one of our large health systems is considering this. One of the things we call for is this work for school-based health centers. To support them, to advance them. We recognize we have a couple in our community that are supported by large grants. Those grants are horizon or about to sunset, so we're being thoughtful about how we keep those, keep continuity with those locations, so that we keep the proof of concept while we consider mapping others. We're pleased at least in St. Louis, the St. Louis Public Schools are in conversation with one of our large health systems about how we may work that out in a list of up to 12 schools right now. So I think you find those things that are most health related. I also encourage you as practitioners in this space to be thoughtful about elements of the report that are in the addendum and the appendix. We're very intentional to take information throughout our various convenings about trauma, people's responses to trauma, where they had seen it, how they see it affecting them. I think that is helpful information for you as it relates to the work you're doing, your considerations of policy advocacy and movement in community. So that's where I would begin. Thank you.
One last question.
I saw the problems in Ferguson as being just as much the administration of the city as the failure to build a good social structure for the kids. So with that in mind, and I'm a retired police officer, so I'm always feeling kind of like want to get under the table, but how do you plan to get the two to come together? Because until you can fix the administration, there'll always be that big block to the community.
Yeah, I think there's some really important actions going on right now that impact this, although spoken indirectly. And I'll say, too, I've had some interesting times getting those groups together. I think the commission was very successful at that. We're very pleased to have the perspective of Chief Dan Isom, retired chief from St. Louis Police Department, and also Kevin Albrand, the president of the Missouri Fraternal Order of Police, to be leading voices on the commission and very vocal and active, particularly in our work around police-community relations, and some of the things we were able to successfully do to increase the police standards and training for continuing education in our state for use of force, for officer wellness, and for anti-bias policing. So those standards are now almost twice what they were before. It was almost shocking to know how low the standards were in these areas. And so I think we have success when we're able to bring those groups together. There was remarkable unity of thought on the recommendations that came out of this working group on police-community relations. Where the challenges came, quite frankly, were in the earlier moments. So pre-commission, I was involved in several attempts, along with folks from the Department of Justice, to sit activists and police down to negotiate rules of engagement for demonstrations, and that was the exciting part. And so I think under the context of the intense nature and the intensity of those moments, it was much more difficult. I think we've got to take advantage of these more peaceful moments to continue to negotiate these kind of rules of engagement. It is also going to be critically important that we're able to institute civilian oversight in the manners that we have suggested in the report. We call for civilian oversight of policing. It's important to note that in 2015 we got civilian oversight, a moniker of civilian oversight in St. Louis for St. Louis Police Department, after a couple of groups have been working on it literally 30 years. Right, so we can't take that long. We got to work with greater urgency in some of these other communities, and it has to be civilian oversight with teeth. Now, what are the ways we're seeking to get at some of that? It's tough to get at that kind of unified engagement and oversight when you've got 57 police departments, 80 courts, and 91 municipalities in the metropolitan region. And so there are a lot of people who disagree with me on this, and this is not in the report, so this is Starsky Wilson speaking. What is in the report is a call for consolidation of courts. I think that's critically important because, as I noted on that day in October when I stood in the St. Anne Police Department, the one thing you have access to when you're on this side of the glass before you go back to meet people on the other side of the glass is an ATM. And so one of the things we came to say with clarity is that this is what's happening with our system of municipal fragmentation. We have a system of municipal fragmentation that costs us millions of dollars, and in order to pay for it, we're using our courts as an ATM, and we're sending police officers out as armed collection agents. And what Kevin was very helpful in articulating for me, and I've been able to articulate for others, is that I don't know one police officer, and I bet you didn't, my sister, I don't know one police officer ever signed up to write tickets. But when we look at the DOJ's report on the Ferguson Police Department, we can see that there are communications from the city manager to the chief of police telling him to get people to write more tickets for the sake of making the city's budget. And so one of the efforts that's going on right now, and I encourage you, if you know a Supreme Court justice in this state, or you know how to get a letter to one, to communicate with them that they have the authority and they should act on the authority of the dissenting opinion of Kimberly Norwood in their municipal court investigation group to consolidate the courts in St. Louis County. Because they have responsibility for oversight of these courts. And when they don't act, quite frankly, as many courts as we have, they just can't oversee them. The number that's closest, so I said we've got 80, there's only 22 in the county around Kansas City, right, under supervision. That's just a vast chasm. We don't believe that effective oversight can happen in that way. And ultimately what's happening is the courts see themselves as reporting to these small municipalities, not reporting to the presiding judge. And so they continue to kind of engage in injustices that provide funding for this system. And if we know nothing, we know that one of the ways you get stuff done is you fund it, and if you don't fund it, you can say it as much as you want, and it won't happen. And so part of what we've got to do in order to consolidate some of these systems, consolidate the police departments, is to consolidate the courts first. And I believe, this is only Starsky Wilson speaking, I believe ultimately we've got to get to some consolidation of these multiple municipalities as well.